The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Montana Territory, turning the world into a white void where sound died and direction became meaningless. Thomas Hartwell pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and urged his horse forward through the drifts, each step a battle against the wind that cut through him like a blade made of ice. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, following a trail that had long since vanished beneath the storm, searching for cattle that were probably already frozen solid somewhere in the wilderness. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, as they often did in this unforgiving country. One moment the sky had been clear and blue, the next it was a grey wall of death rolling across the plains. Thomas had seen storms like this before, had lost good men to their fury, but he'd never been caught this far from shelter when one hit. His ranch was still 20 miles south, and the nearest town was even farther. All he could do was keep moving and hope to find some kind of refuge before the cold claimed him too. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Buck, suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. Thomas spurred him gently, but the animal just stood there, ears pricked forward, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear over the howling wind. Then Buck whinnied softly and began walking again, but not in the direction Thomas had been heading. The horse turned east toward a line of pine trees that formed a dark smudge against the white landscape. "What is it, boy?" Thomas muttered, his words swallowed by the storm. But he'd learned to trust his horse's instincts over the years. Animals could sense things humans missed, could hear sounds that didn't carry on the wind, could smell life and death in ways that defied explanation. As they approached the tree line, Thomas heard it, a sound so faint it might have been his imagination, a crying thin and desperate, like a kitten lost in the snow. He dismounted and followed the sound, his boots crunching through drifts that came up to his knees. The crying led him to a cluster of boulders near the edge of the forest, where the wind had carved out a small shelter from the snow. There, curled up in a hollow between 2 rocks, was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his small body wrapped in a torn blanket that provided little protection against the storm. His skin was blue with cold, his lips nearly black, and his breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. He was Native American. Thomas could see that much, with long black hair that was matted with ice and snow. How he'd ended up here, alone in the middle of a blizzard, was a mystery that would have to wait. "Hey there, little one," Thomas said softly, kneeling beside the child. "Hey, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whimper. Thomas could see that the child was dying, that the cold had already begun its final work. Without immediate warmth and shelter, the boy would be dead within the hour. Thomas didn't hesitate. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around the small body, then lifted the child in his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had already begun to steal his substance. Thomas carried him to where Buck waited, patient and steady despite the storm, and somehow managed to mount with the child cradled against his chest. The ride back to his ranch was a nightmare of wind and snow and numbing cold. Thomas had to stop twice to check that the boy was still breathing, had to warm the small hands and feet with his own body heat to keep the circulation going. By the time they reached the ranch house, Thomas could barely feel his own fingers, and the child had slipped into unconsciousness. The ranch was small and isolated, just a log cabin and a barn set in a valley that provided some protection from the worst of the weather. Thomas had built it himself 5 years ago, after his wife died, and he decided he needed to be alone with his grief. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and right now, that was all that mattered. He carried the boy inside and immediately began working to save his life. He stripped off the wet clothes and wrapped the child in dry blankets, then built up the fire until the cabin was almost stifling. He heated water and used it to slowly warm the boy's hands and feet, massaging the circulation back into the frozen limbs. He made hot broth and tried to get the child to swallow a few spoonfuls, though most of it dribbled down his chin. It was touch and go for the first few hours. The boy's breathing was so shallow, Thomas had to put his ear to the small chest to make sure the heart was still beating. His skin remained a frightening shade of blue, and his body temperature seemed to hover just above the point of no return. But slowly, gradually, warmth began to return to the small form. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself thinking about the boy's story. How had he ended up alone in the middle of a blizzard? Where was his family? Was he lost? Or had he been abandoned? The questions multiplied, but there were no answers, only the sound of the wind outside and the child's labored breathing. Thomas dozed fitfully in his chair by the fire, waking every few minutes to check on his unexpected guest. Sometime near dawn, he was startled awake by a sound he hadn't heard in years, a child's voice, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The boy was awake, his dark eyes clear and alert for the first time since Thomas had found him. "Easy there," Thomas said softly, moving to the boy's side. "You're safe now. You're in my house, and you're going to be all right." The child looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, then spoke again in what Thomas recognized as a native tongue. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Questions, confusion, maybe a little gratitude mixed with wariness. "I don't speak your language, son," Thomas said gently, "but I found you in the snow and I brought you here to get warm. You were nearly frozen solid." The boy studied Thomas's face for a long moment, then pointed to himself and said, "Takoda." "Takoda," Thomas repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name. "That's a fine name. I'm Thomas. You're safe here, Takoda. Nobody's going to hurt you." The child nodded slowly, as if he understood more English than he could speak. He struggled to sit up, and Thomas helped him, propping him against the pillows. Takoda looked around the cabin with wide eyes, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, the fire crackling in the stone hearth. "Hungry?" Thomas asked, miming eating. "Food?" Takoda nodded eagerly, and Thomas went to the kitchen to prepare something more substantial than broth. He made flapjacks and bacon, simple fare but filling, and was amazed to watch the boy eat with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days. As Takoda ate, Thomas studied him more carefully. The boy was thin, almost gaunt, with the kind of wiry build that spoke of a hard life. His clothes, what was left of them, were well made but worn, suggesting a family that had some means but had fallen on hard times. There were no obvious signs of abuse, but Thomas noticed the way the child's eyes constantly moved, always watching for danger, always ready to run. "Where's your family, Takoda?" Thomas asked gently. "Your mama and papa?" The boy's face darkened, and he spoke a few words in his native language. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the pain behind them. Something had happened to this child's family, something that had left him alone in the world. Thomas spent the rest of the morning trying to communicate with Takoda, using gestures and simple words to establish basic understanding. The boy was smart, picking up English phrases quickly, and by noon they had worked out a rudimentary system of communication. Thomas learned that Takoda was indeed 8 years old, that he had been wandering in the snow for 3 days, and that his family was gone, though what exactly that meant remained unclear. The storm continued to rage outside, making travel impossible. Thomas didn't mind. He found himself enjoying the boy's company, the way Takoda's eyes lit up when he learned a new English word, the careful way he helped with simple chores around the cabin. It had been a long time since Thomas had shared his home with anyone, and he'd forgotten how good it felt to have another person's presence fill the empty spaces. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Takoda began to tell his story. His English was still limited, but he supplemented it with gestures and drawings scratched in the dirt of the cabin floor. What emerged was a tale of tragedy that was all too common on the frontier. Takoda's people had been living peacefully in a valley to the north, trying to survive on a reservation that provided barely enough food to keep them alive. When the government decided to move them again, to land that was even more barren, some of the families had refused to go. They'd tried to escape, to find a place where they could live free, but the soldiers had caught up with them. "They came at night," Takoda said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fire, guns, screaming." Thomas felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this before, had seen the aftermath of such encounters. The frontier was full of graves that shouldn't exist, of children who had been orphaned by the advance of civilization. "What happened to your family?" Thomas asked gently. Takoda's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. "Mama told me to run, hide in the woods. I ran and ran, but I got lost. The snow came and I couldn't find my way." Thomas reached out and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. I'm truly sorry." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Takoda spoke again, his voice small but determined. "My people will come looking for me," he said. "They will find me." Thomas nodded, though privately he wondered if there was anyone left to look. The frontier was littered with the remnants of destroyed families, scattered tribes, children who had been lost to the wind and snow and violence, but he didn't want to crush the boy's hope, not when hope might be all he had left. The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Thomas woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through the cabin windows and the blessed silence that comes after a great wind finally dies. He looked over at Takoda, who was still sleeping peacefully in the makeshift bed Thomas had prepared for him, and felt a strange sense of contentment. It was while he was making breakfast that he heard the sound of approaching horses. Thomas looked out the window and felt his blood run cold. A group of riders was approaching the cabin, maybe 20 or 30 of them, moving in formation across the snow-covered valley. Even at a distance, he could see that they were Native Americans, warriors by their bearing and the way they sat their horses. Thomas reached for his rifle, then paused. He looked back at Takoda, who was now awake and listening intently to the sound of hoofbeats. The boy's face had changed, lighting up with an expression of joy and relief that Thomas had never seen before. "My people," Takoda whispered, then louder. "My people." The boy struggled to his feet and ran to the window, pressing his face against the glass. Thomas watched as the riders drew closer, and he began to make out individual faces. They were Lakota, he realized, and they were painted for war. Thomas set down his rifle and opened the cabin door. There was no point in running, and he'd learned long ago that facing trouble head-on was usually the best course. He stepped outside, Takoda at his side, and watched as the war party approached. The leader was a man of perhaps 50, his face marked with the scars of battle and the lines of wisdom. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers and carried a lance decorated with scalps and coop feathers. His eyes were hard as flint as he looked at Thomas, but they softened when they fell on Takoda. The warrior said something in Lakota, and Takoda responded excitedly, running toward the war party, despite his still weakened condition. Two of the riders dismounted and caught him up in their arms, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Thomas could see the relief and joy on their faces, the way they held the boy as if he were more precious than gold. The leader dismounted and walked toward Thomas, his hand resting on the handle of his war club. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped and studied Thomas with eyes that seemed to see everything. "You are the one who found our son," the warrior said in accented but clear English. Thomas nodded. "I found him in the snow, nearly frozen. I brought him here to get warm. I am Chief Standing Bear," the warrior said. "Takoda is my grandson." Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that the boy had family left, that he wouldn't be alone in the world. Apprehension because he knew the reputation of Standing Bear, knew that the chief was considered one of the most formidable war leaders on the northern plains. "I'm Thomas Hartwell," he replied. "I was glad to help." Standing Bear studied him for a long moment, then spoke to his warriors in Lakota. Several of them dismounted and began examining the cabin, the barn, the surrounding area. Thomas realized they were checking for signs of others, making sure this wasn't some kind of trap. "My grandson tells me you have cared for him as if he were your own child," Standing Bear said. "That you shared your food, your warmth, your home." "He was hurt and hungry," Thomas said simply. "It was the right thing to do." "Many of your people would not have seen it that way," the chief replied. "Many would have seen only a young Indian to be killed or driven away." Thomas had no answer to that, because he knew it was true. The frontier was full of men who would have left Dakota to die in the snow, or worse. Standing Bear walked around Thomas, studying him like a predator, evaluating prey. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've heard the name," Thomas admitted. "And what have you heard?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "I've heard that you're a man who protects his people, that you've never surrendered to the white man's government, that you've fought battles and won them." "All true," Standing Bear said. "I have killed many white men, and I will kill many more before I die. But I have never killed a man who showed kindness to my family." The chief stopped in front of Thomas and looked him directly in the eyes. "You saved my grandson's life. By our laws, by our traditions, this creates a debt that must be paid." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "I don't want payment. I was just doing what anyone should do." "What anyone should do. But few actually would," Standing Bear corrected. "You acted with honor, and honor must be recognized." The chief turned and spoke to his warriors, and Thomas watched as they began to unload supplies from their pack horses. Bundles of furs, bags of what looked like food, tools and weapons wrapped in deerskin. They placed these items on the ground in front of Thomas's cabin, creating a small mountain of trade goods. "This is payment for my grandson's life," Standing Bear said. "These furs will keep you warm through many winters. The food will sustain you when hunting is poor. The tools will help you work your land." Thomas looked at the pile of goods, overwhelmed by the generosity. "This is too much. I can't accept all this." "You cannot refuse," Standing Bear said firmly. "To refuse would be to dishonor the gift and the giver. You will accept because honor demands it." One of the warriors approached and spoke quietly to Standing Bear in Lakota. The chief nodded, then turned back to Thomas. "My grandson wishes to stay with you for a while longer," he said. "He says you have been teaching him the white man's language, and he wants to learn more." Thomas looked at Dakota, who was standing between two of the warriors, his face bright with hope. "I'd be honored to have him stay," Thomas said. "But shouldn't he be with his people?" "His people are scattered," Standing Bear said sadly. "The soldiers destroyed our winter camp, killed many of our elders. We are trying to survive in the mountains, but it is hard. Perhaps it would be better for Dakota to stay here, to learn the white man's ways. Knowledge is a weapon, and he will need all the weapons he can gather." Thomas understood. The chief was thinking about the future, about a world where his grandson might need to navigate between two cultures to survive. "He's welcome to stay as long as he wants," Thomas said. Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "You are a man of honor, Thomas Hartwell. That is rare in these times." The chief walked over to Dakota and knelt down, speaking to him in Lakota. Thomas could see the love and concern in the old warrior's face, could see how difficult it was for him to leave his grandson behind. Finally, Standing Bear stood and embraced the boy, holding him for a long moment. "I will return in the spring," he told Dakota in English. "Be strong, learn much, and remember who you are." Dakota nodded bravely, though Thomas could see the tears in his eyes. "I will remember, grandfather." Standing, Bear mounted his horse and looked down at Thomas one last time. "If anyone threatens my grandson, if any harm comes to him while he is in your care, I will know, and I will come." I understand," Thomas said. The chief nodded, then spoke a command in Lakota. The war party wheeled their horses and began to ride away, disappearing into the snow-covered wilderness as quickly as they had come. Thomas and Takoda stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching until the last rider vanished from sight. "Will you miss them?" Thomas asked. Takoda nodded. "But I am happy to stay with you. You are a good teacher." Thomas smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Come on, son. Let's get that trading post organized and figure out what we're going to do with all those furs." The months that followed were unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Having Takoda in his home changed everything, filled the cabin with laughter and conversation and the simple joy of shared meals and evening stories. The boy was a quick learner, picking up English with amazing speed, and Thomas found himself learning too. Not just words and phrases in Lakota, but new ways of seeing the world. Takoda taught him about tracking, about reading the signs that animals left in their passage. He showed Thomas how to find edible plants, how to predict the weather by watching the behavior of birds, how to move through the forest without making a sound. In return, Thomas taught him to read and write, to work with tools, to understand the ways of the white man's world. Spring came early that year, and with it the promise of new beginnings. Thomas had been dreading Standing Bear's return, knowing that it would mean losing Takoda, but when the chief arrived with a small group of warriors, Thomas was surprised by what he found. "My grandson has grown," Standing Bear said, watching as Takoda demonstrated his English by reading from one of Thomas's books. "He is strong and healthy, and he has learned much." "He's a good boy," Thomas said, "smart as a whip and willing to work." "You have been a good teacher," the chief replied, "and a good father." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Thomas had been trying not to think of their relationship in those terms, but the truth was that he had come to love Takoda like a son. The boy had filled a hole in his life that he hadn't even realized existed. "I have a proposition," Standing Bear said. "My people are moving farther north, into Canada, where the white man's army cannot follow. It is a hard journey, and harder still to start over in a new place. Takoda could come with us, or, Thomas prompted, or he could stay here with you. You have shown that you care for him, that you will protect him and teach him. Perhaps it is better for him to grow up in both worlds, to understand the old ways and the new." Thomas looked at Takoda, who was listening intently despite pretending to read. "What do you want to do, son?" Takoda set down the book and looked at his grandfather, then at Thomas. "I want to stay," he said quietly. "This is my home now." Standing Bear nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Then it is settled. But remember, boy, you are still Lakota. You carry the blood of warriors, the wisdom of your ancestors. Do not forget who you are." "I won't forget," Takoda promised. The chief spent 3 days at the ranch teaching Takoda stories and songs, sharing the history of their people. On the morning of the 4th day, he prepared to leave, but not before one final conversation with Thomas. "I am giving you my grandson," Standing Bear said. "Not as a servant, not as a curiosity, but as a son. You will raise him with honor, teach him to be strong, help him find his place in the world." "I will," Thomas promised. "And if the day comes when our peoples are at war again, when the soldiers come looking for Indians to kill, you will remember that he is under your protection. You will keep him safe." Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility, the magnitude of the trust being placed in him. "I will protect him with my life." Standing Bear smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, Thomas saw warmth in the old warrior's eyes. "I believe you will. You are a man of honor, Thomas Hartwell. My grandson is fortunate to have found you." The chief mounted his horse and rode away, but this time there was no sadness in the parting. There was only the promise of a future, the hope that love and understanding could bridge the divide between two worlds. Thomas and Takoda stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The boy had grown taller over the winter, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper. He was becoming a young man, and Thomas felt a fierce pride in the person he was becoming. "Do you ever regret staying?" Thomas asked. Dakota considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "No," he said finally. "I think this is where I was meant to be, with you, learning to be a bridge between two worlds." Thomas smiled and put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "I think you're right, son. I think you're exactly where you're meant to be." Years passed, and the story of Thomas Hartwell and his adopted son became legend in the Montana Territory. Dakota grew into a fine young man, fluent in both English and Lakota, comfortable in both worlds. He became a translator and negotiator, helping to prevent conflicts between the tribes and the white settlers. He married a schoolteacher from the nearby town, a woman who loved him for his gentle wisdom and his fierce sense of justice. Thomas lived to see his grandson born, a boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle smile. He taught the child to ride and fish, to read the signs of the weather and the tracks of animals. He told him stories of the old days, when the frontier was still wild and dangerous, when a simple act of kindness could change the course of history. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the moon was full, Standing Bear would visit, an old man now, but still proud and strong. He would sit by the fire with Thomas and Dakota, sharing stories of the old days, teaching the newest generation about their heritage. "You chose well," Standing Bear told Thomas one evening. "You saw not an Indian child to be feared, but a son to be loved. That choice made all the difference." Thomas nodded, watching as his grandson played with wooden toys by the fire. "Sometimes the smallest choices have the biggest consequences." "Yes," the old chief agreed, "sometimes they do." In the end, that was the lesson of Thomas Hartwell and Dakota Standing Bear, that kindness is never wasted, that love can transcend any divide, and that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the family we're born into. The frontier was a harsh place, full of violence and sorrow and loss. But it was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where a cowboy could find a freezing child in the snow and discover that saving a life could also save his own. Because someone should. Because children need protecting. Because love, in all its forms, is the greatest force in the world. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything.